They said my great-grandfather's 80-year-old dam was an eyesore and safety hazard, so they bulldozed it while I was at my daughter's wedding. I came home from Autumn's reception to find 80 years of hand-cut limestone blocks reduced to rubble, muddy water rushing wild, and the smell of diesel fumes hanging thick in the evening air. The controlled flow that had protected our neighborhood since 1943, destroyed in 4 hours by a woman who moved here from California 2 years ago. There stood Cordelia Blackthorne on her pristine deck, sipping what looked like champagne, watching raw creek water flood into her own subdivision's storm drains. The HOA notice taped to my mailbox, $12,000 in unpaid infrastructure fees for a dam that existed before her precious neighborhood was even a developer's fever dream. Here's what they don't teach you in HOA president school. Water always wins. And I'm a retired Army Corps engineer who's about to give it some very specific directions. What would you do if petty officials destroyed something your family built with their own hands? Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and tell me your worst HOA horror story. My name's Ezekiel Ironwood, Zeke, to anyone who's earned the right to skip the formalities. Third-generation owner of 15 acres that my grandfather Jeremiah carved out of Missouri wilderness back when men solved problems with dynamite and determination instead of lawyers and homeowners associations. Jeremiah built our dam in 1943 with hand-cut limestone blocks and old-school German engineering. No mortar, just precisely fitted stones that had been holding back seasonal floods for 80 years. Every spring you could hear the gentle trickle of controlled water over those worn stones, smell the wet limestone mixed with wild mint growing along the banks, and feel the smooth texture of rocks polished by decades of patient water flow. I inherited more than property when Jeremiah passed. I got his stubborn streak and 23 years of Army Corps engineering experience. After 3 tours and a medical retirement, I was perfectly content living in our modest farmhouse, watching my daughter Autumn grow up where bullfrogs sang their evening concerts and afternoon sunlight filtered through oak branches like nature's own stained glass. Then the developers came. Willowbrook Estates sprouted around us in 1995 like mushrooms after rain, cookie-cutter houses for people who thought rustic charm was something you bought at Pottery Barn. Our creek became their water feature. Our flood control became their eyesore. Most neighbors were decent folks, but every subdivision needs its queen bee, and ours came with a California driver's license and the social skills of a particularly aggressive wasp. Enter Cordelia Blackthorne, former city planning assistant, current HOA president for 3 terms running, future migraine in designer clothing. She drove a white Tesla that never seemed to pick up road dust, maintained a yard so sterile it could double as a surgical suite, and had perfected the art of smiling while mentally calculating how much your backward local customs were costing her portfolio. The first shot came 2 months after Autumn's engagement. "Mr. Ironwood," she said, standing on my porch in jeans that probably cost more than my disability check, "we need to discuss your property's integration with community standards." Integration? Like I was defective software that needed updating. "Ma'am, my property was here before your community existed," I replied, watching her dismiss hand-carved porch posts with the same expression she'd use for roadkill. "That's precisely the problem." She produced a folder thick enough to stop bullets. "Your rustic infrastructure poses safety concerns. That dam especially. It's creating liability exposure, and frankly, Mr. Ironwood, some residents find your lifestyle incompatible with our investment protection. My lifestyle. Code for, you people don't belong here." The smell of her expensive perfume couldn't quite mask the scent of premium-grade bullshit and barely concealed contempt. I offered compromise, regular inspections, minor maintenance, whatever would keep the peace. But Cordelia had that predatory look people get when they've decided you're the nail and they're the hammer. Her first unfair act? She called Child Protective Services, claiming my property was unsafe for children because Autumn still visited with her fiancé's kids. Anonymous tip, of course, but the timing was surgical, right during wedding planning. The harassment campaign had begun, and Cordelia had just declared war on 4 generations of my family. But she'd miscalculated one thing about retired military engineers. We don't just build things to last. We build them to survive people exactly like her. 3 weeks after the CPS visit, which thankfully ended with the social worker apologizing for the obvious malicious report, a certified letter arrived that made Cordelia's previous harassment look like amateur hour. $12,000 in retroactive infrastructure fees for my 80-year-old dam. I read the legal gibberish twice, standing in my gravel driveway while the mail truck's diesel exhaust still hung in the morning air like a toxic cloud of bureaucratic bullshit. The rough paper crinkled between my fingers as I processed the sheer audacity. According to HOA consultant Brantley Blackthorne, yes, you caught that last name, my dam was negatively impacting downstream water management systems and required immediate remediation assessment fees. The twisted logic was almost impressive in its audacity. My dam, which had been controlling creek flow since before their subdivision existed, was somehow retroactively responsible for improvements they'd made to handle runoff from houses that shouldn't have been built on a floodplain in the first place. It was like blaming the lighthouse for the rocks. 30 days to pay or face remediation proceedings. Translation: pay up or we'll destroy your family heritage with the enthusiastic efficiency of a toddler with a sledgehammer. But here's where Cordelia made her first big mistake. I'm not just a retired engineer. I'm a paranoid retired engineer who believes in documentation. A quick Google search on Mr. Brantley Blackthorne revealed something my old Army Corps buddies had drilled into me. Always check professional credentials. Turns out this expert was licensed in Texas, but practicing hydrology consulting in Missouri without proper state credentials. Back in my Corps days, we'd seen contractors try this shell game constantly, operate just outside their jurisdiction to avoid oversight and accountability. My sergeant used to say, always verify the license before you trust the expertise, and that advice had just saved me 12 grand and handed me a legal sledgehammer of my own. My counterpunch was swift, surgical, and extremely public. I filed complaints with the Missouri State Licensing Board about unlicensed practice, demanded itemized breakdowns of every alleged improvement the fees were supposed to cover, and requested HOA budget transparency at their monthly meeting, in front of 63 residents who suddenly realized they'd been funding a personal vendetta. The smell of fresh coffee brewing during my late-night research sessions mixed with the satisfaction of watching Cordelia's airtight plan develop its first major leak. A simple license verification had just destroyed months of expensive legal groundwork. Sometimes the most effective weapons are the ones hiding in plain sight. Cordelia's reaction was predictably defensive and spectacularly stupid. She fired off passive-aggressive emails about harassment of professional staff and scheduled an emergency HOA board meeting, conveniently excluding non-residents like me from attendance. Because nothing says we're totally legitimate like secret meetings and defensive tantrums worthy of a reality TV show. But the damage was done and spreading like water through a cracked foundation. Longtime residents like Dalton Greystone, a retired teacher who'd lived here 30 years, started asking uncomfortable questions about why they were suddenly paying emergency assessments to fund legal battles they'd never voted on. Savannah Riverside, a widow on a fixed income, began showing up at my door with her own copies of suspicious HOA invoices and a growing suspicion that she'd been played. The community was fracturing along predictable lines. Newer residents clutching their property value fears like life preservers, while old-timers quietly wondered when their neighborhood association had transformed into something that would make organized crime families blush with embarrassment at the amateur hour corruption. Anonymous social media harassment ramped up with the sophistication of middle school bullies armed with fake accounts. Someone was spreading rumors about dangerous veterans and unstable dam infrastructure, the digital equivalent of throwing spaghetti at a wall and praying for marinara sauce to stick. The sound of my boots on gravel as I walked to check my mailbox each morning had become a daily reminder that this was far from over. But now those footsteps carried the confidence of someone who just landed the first real blow in what was shaping up to be a very educational war. Cordelia's response to my licensing board complaint arrived faster than a tax audit on lottery winners. Apparently, nothing motivates HOA presidents quite like public embarrassment in front of people who actually pay their salary. Enter Pemberton and Associates, the kind of aggressive real estate law firm that makes ambulance chasers look dignified by comparison. Their letterhead was thick enough to armor a tank, and their first certified letter hit my mailbox with all the subtlety of a freight train carrying bad news and overpriced legal fees. The new claim? My dam created catastrophic liability exposure for the HOA, and I needed professional liability insurance or immediate removal proceedings would commence. The letter smelled like expensive cologne and pure desperation. Apparently, when your fake expert gets his license yanked, the next move is hiring real lawyers to make the same fake arguments with fancier vocabulary. But here's where my engineering background proved invaluable again. During my core days, I'd learned that the most dangerous opponent isn't the one screaming threats, it's the one quietly building a better mousetrap. So while Cordelia was carpet bombing my mailbox with legal intimidation, I was doing what engineers do best: systematic problem solving and meticulous documentation. The pressure campaign escalated with the efficiency of a military operation. Daily certified letters arrived like clockwork, each one ratcheting up the language and compressing the deadlines. County inspectors began materializing at inconvenient hours, always responding to anonymous safety concerns that read like Cordelia's greatest hits album. The local newspaper received a concerned citizen letter about aging infrastructure dangers, written in prose so overwrought it belonged in a soap opera script. Then, while sorting through the legal avalanche one evening, I discovered something that made my coffee taste bitter with irony. The sound of rustling documents had become my evening soundtrack, but one invoice caught my attention like a fire alarm in a library. Cordelia's legal fees weren't coming from her designer purse. They were being funded through emergency assessments levied on every HOA resident, including the very people she claimed to be protecting from my dangerous dam. My neighbor, Dalton Greystone, confirmed the scam when he appeared at my door clutching his assessment notice like evidence of war crimes. "Zeke," he said, his retired teacher's voice shaking with controlled fury, "I've been paying legal fees to destroy your family's dam. When exactly did we vote to fund this woman's personal jihad?" The answer, of course, was never. Cordelia had been operating like a dictator with a homeowners association, using community funds to finance personal vendettas. In my military experience, we had a technical term for officers who abused their authority for personal gain. We called them candidates for court-martial. My counterpunch involved strategic precision that would have made my old commanding officer proud. I contacted Marlo Chen, an environmental law attorney who specialized in water rights and harbored a professional grudge against HOA overreach. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests for every county communication about my property. Most importantly, I began documenting each HOA bylaw violation with the methodical thoroughness of someone building a federal case, because that's exactly what this was becoming. The legal discovery revealed what I'd suspected. The HOA had never properly incorporated authority over pre-existing properties. Cordelia had been issuing orders with all the legal validity of a mall security guard trying to arrest federal agents. Multiple board decisions violated Missouri Sunshine Law requirements, and her emergency assessments had about as much legitimacy as a $3 bill printed on toilet paper. From dealing with military bureaucracy, I'd learned that organizations operating on questionable authority absolutely hate having their power challenged in well-lit public forums by people who've actually read the relevant laws. Community response was swift and deeply satisfying. Dalton started attending every HOA meeting armed with pointed questions about financial transparency. Savannah Riverside, that sweet widow who'd been quietly paying assessments she couldn't afford, began organizing other fixed-income residents who'd suddenly realized they were bankrolling someone else's power trip. Clandestine meetings convened in my kitchen, where the aroma of strong coffee mixed with the quiet determination of people who'd finally recognized they'd been systematically conned. We called ourselves Concerned Residents, but we were really a support group for victims of HOA financial abuse. Cordelia's desperation became obvious when she issued a 48-hour emergency abatement notice, claiming sudden dam inspection had revealed catastrophic structural deficiencies requiring immediate demolition. The timing was surgically precise, scheduled for Autumn's wedding weekend, when family obligations would supposedly prevent me from interfering. But Cordelia had made one critical miscalculation about retired military engineers. She assumed I'd choose my daughter's happiness over my family's 80-year legacy. She was about to discover that engineers don't just build structures to withstand natural disasters. We design them to survive human ones too. And I'd been planning for this particular storm since the day she first knocked on my door. The morning of Autumn's wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect October day that makes you believe the universe occasionally gets its act together. I was adjusting my dress uniform in the mirror, thinking about walking my daughter down the same path where 4 generations of Ironwoods had celebrated life's biggest moments, when the sound of heavy machinery shattered the morning peace like a wrecking ball through a cathedral. 6 a.m., diesel engines roaring to life, the unmistakable hydraulic whine of excavators warming up for destruction. I stepped onto my porch still buttoning my jacket and saw them, a demolition crew positioned around my grandfather's dam like vultures at an all-you-can-eat buffet. Cordelia stood nearby in designer boots that had probably never seen honest dirt, clipboard in hand, directing the operation with the gleeful efficiency of someone who'd timed this moment for maximum emotional devastation. "Emergency safety order," she announced when she spotted me, waving an official-looking document like a conquistador's flag. Structural inspection revealed immediate collapse risk. "We're protecting the community from your negligence." The crew had already positioned their equipment when I approached, my dress shoes crunching on gravel that would soon be mixed with 80 years of family history. The excavator operator looked about as comfortable as a vegetarian at a barbecue festival, probably because destroying someone's heritage while they're dressed for their daughter's wedding tends to make even hardened contractors question their career choices. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level despite rage building like steam pressure in a boiler, "I'm going to need to see that emergency order and the inspection report that triggered it." Cordelia's smile had all the warmth of a tax audit. "The safety of this community takes precedence over your sentimental attachments, Mr. Ironwood. This structure is a liability we can no longer tolerate." That's when my engineering eye caught something that made my blood pressure spike. Her emergency order had dates that didn't match reality. The inspection supposedly triggering this urgent demolition had been conducted 3 weeks ago, and the work permit she was brandishing like evidence was actually an expired county authorization from an unrelated drainage project 6 months old. My counterpunch was immediate and public. "Folks," I called out to the growing crowd of early arriving wedding guests, "y'all might want to document this. Mrs. Blackthorne is about to commit what appears to be destruction of private property using fraudulent paperwork during a family celebration." But Cordelia had made one spectacular miscalculation in her timing. Today wasn't just my daughter's wedding. It was the day she'd invited 150 witnesses to watch her destroy my family's legacy, including retired Judge Clarence Whitfield and military chaplain Father Benedict Stone, both of whom understood the difference between legal authority and elaborate criminal theater. The first hydraulic claw bit into limestone that had weathered 8 decades of Missouri storms, and the sound was like civilization itself breaking apart. Clear water that had flowed controlled and peaceful since 1943 suddenly rushed wild and unrestrained, carrying away topsoil and decades of careful erosion control like nature's own revenge. Within 2 hours, what had taken my grandfather months to build was reduced to rubble and muddy chaos. The ceremony relocated to the church basement, Autumn's white dress hem stained with creek mud, and 150 wedding guests transformed into very angry witnesses to what looked increasingly like premeditated vandalism disguised as municipal authority. The texture of my daughter's muddy dress between my fingers, as I helped her navigate the chaos, felt like holding evidence of a war crime committed against my family's most sacred moment. But here's what Cordelia's California-bred arrogance hadn't anticipated. Midwestern wedding guests don't passively watch family heritage get bulldozed during celebrations. The entire guest list became instant advocates armed with smartphones, recording every moment of bureaucratic savagery timed for maximum cruelty. Judge Whitfield cornered me during the relocated reception, his weathered face grim with professional outrage. "Zeke, that wasn't a legal demolition. Emergency orders require specific protocols, and what I witnessed was either catastrophic incompetence or deliberate fraud with federal implications." Father Benedict offered something more valuable: connections to investigative journalists who specialized in government overreach stories. "Son," he said, straightening his collar with hands that had blessed soldiers heading into combat, "sometimes evil hides behind paperwork and procedure, but truth has a way of surfacing like water finding cracks in stone." The immediate consequences were swift and deeply poetic. Uncontrolled water flow began flooding HOA common areas within hours, turning their pristine walking trails into muddy disasters that resembled the aftermath of biblical judgment. Local news picked up the wedding day demolition story by evening, complete with video footage of Cordelia directing destruction, while formally dressed guests watched in horrified fascination. Social media exploded with #JusticeForZeke hashtags and darkly humorous commentary about HOA presidents who apparently objected to happiness occurring near functional infrastructure. Several board members quietly developed amnesia about supporting Cordelia's increasingly unhinged leadership style, but the real game changer was hiding among the wedding debris. As we cleaned up the next morning, wind-blown documents from the flooding had scattered across my property, including water-damaged HOA financial records that had literally blown from Cordelia's yard during the chaos her own destruction had unleashed. Those soggy papers contained secrets that would transform this personal vendetta into a federal criminal case. Cordelia had just handed me the ammunition to destroy her completely, gift-wrapped in the consequences of her own cruelty. The smell of diesel exhaust still hung in the morning air as I smoothed out documents that would redirect the flow of justice exactly where it needed to go. The water-damaged documents scattered across my yard looked like confetti from Hell's own victory party, but as I smoothed out the soggy papers on my kitchen table, the same oak surface where 3 generations of ironwoods had solved family problems, I realized Cordelia's flood had delivered something more valuable than revenge. It had delivered a confession written in her own handwriting. HOA financial records, literally blown from her yard during the chaos, told a story that made her damn obsession suddenly crystal clear. The musty smell of wet paper mixed with the bitter aroma of my morning coffee as I processed what I was seeing. This wasn't about safety, liability, or community standards. This was about covering up theft that would make Bernie Madoff blush with professional admiration. The first document stopped me cold, a bank statement showing the HOA's actual balance, negative $847,000. $847,000 in debt from a beautification project that had somehow transformed the neighborhood budget into a financial black hole, deeper than Cordelia's moral compass. But that number was just the warm-up act for the main event. Invoice after invoice revealed payments to Blackthorn Landscaping Solutions, a company that existed only in Cordelia's imagination and bank account. $200,000 for landscaping work that had never been performed, maintenance that had never happened, and consulting fees for expertise that apparently consisted of advanced embezzlement techniques and creative accounting worthy of organized crime. The timeline hit me like cold water in the face. Cordelia had been systematically draining community funds for 2 years, using shell companies and fake invoices with all the subtlety of a bank robbery staged during a marching band parade. When residents started questioning rising assessments and declining services, she needed a distraction spectacular enough to justify emergency expenditures and insurance claims. Enter my grandfather's dam, not as a safety hazard, but as a financial scapegoat. The insurance correspondence made my engineer's brain hurt with its sheer audacity. Email chains between Cordelia and an adjuster discussed how catastrophic upstream infrastructure failure could trigger massive coverage for flood damage to common areas. The plan was elegantly simple and thoroughly criminal. Destroy my dam, blame the resulting chaos on failed pre-existing infrastructure, and use insurance payouts to replace stolen money while painting me as the negligent property owner who'd endangered the entire community. My family's 80-year legacy had become the patsy for her 2-year crime spree, but desperation had made Cordelia sloppy in ways that would make career criminals weep with embarrassment. Email timestamps showed she'd been planning insurance fraud before the dam destruction, complete with pre-staged photographs of pre-existing damage to areas that would conveniently flood when my creek ran wild. From my military experience with supply chain corruption, I recognized this level of financial manipulation required either spectacular stupidity or pathological confidence in personal invincibility. Cordelia had apparently embraced both philosophies with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never heard of federal prison. The smoking gun was buried in a folder marked Emergency Reserves, bank transfer records showing HOA funds flowing to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Because nothing says legitimate neighborhood association, like international money laundering operations that would impress cartel accountants. Marlo Chen's assessment the next morning was swift and professionally devastating. Zeke, she said, spreading the evidence across her conference table like evidence from a federal task force. This isn't simple embezzlement. We're looking at wire fraud, mail fraud, insurance fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. Federal prosecutors will be fighting over who gets to try this case. The power dynamic had just executed a complete reversal that would have impressed military strategists. I wasn't defending my property against HOA overreach. I was sitting on evidence that would send their president to federal prison for decades while recovering every stolen penny, plus punitive damages that would bankrupt her into the next geological era. But timing would determine whether we caught a thief or just scared away a flight risk. Exposing Cordelia immediately might trigger evidence destruction or an express flight to non-extradition countries. The smart play involved letting her continue digging while federal authorities built an escape-proof case. Judge Whitfield's federal connections proved invaluable for coordinating the investigation without alerting our target. "Son," he said, reviewing evidence with clinical precision honed by decades of judicial experience, "this woman has committed enough federal crimes to keep prosecutors busy until retirement, but we need to catch her actively moving money, not just holding proof of historical theft." The irony was delicious enough to serve at state dinners. Cordelia had destroyed my family's heritage to cover up stealing from the very neighbors she'd convinced to fund her legal war against me. Those same people would soon have front row seats to watching their trusted leader get arrested for robbing them systematically and creatively. Father Benedict captured the moment perfectly during our next kitchen strategy session. Evil has a tendency to consume itself, Zeke. Our responsibility is ensuring the community gets an unobstructed view of the consequences. My kitchen table had transformed into a war room that would have impressed Pentagon strategists, covered with evidence folders, legal documents, and enough coffee cups to caffeinate a small army. The smell of fresh brewing mixed with the satisfaction of watching a plan come together with the precision of Swiss clockwork operated by very angry engineers. The team assembled around that oak table represented everything Cordelia had catastrophically underestimated about small-town networks and military precision planning. Marlo Chen brought environmental law expertise and a personal vendetta against HOA corruption that burned hotter than asphalt in August. Judge Clarence Whitfield contributed federal connections and 4 decades of legal strategy refined by watching criminals who thought they were smarter than the Constitution. Father Benedict offered community organizing skills and the kind of moral authority that makes people confess sins they'd forgotten committing. Our resident intelligence network consisted of some impressively motivated neighbors. Dalton Greystone had access to HOA meeting minutes and the observational skills of someone who'd survived 30 years of middle school politics. Savannah Riverside tracked financial irregularities with spreadsheet precision that would make IRS auditors weep with professional envy. Preston Ashworth, the former board member who'd quit in disgust, had kept copies of everything because he'd seen this disaster coming from 3 fiscal years away. Marlo mapped out our legal strategy like a general planning D-Day, but with better coffee and significantly more righteous anger. We'd document every HOA bylaw violation while preparing criminal referrals for embezzlement and fraud. Civil suits for property destruction would run parallel to challenges against the HOA's fundamental authority over pre-existing properties. From my core days, I remembered that effective attacks hit multiple targets simultaneously. When you're flanked from 6 directions, everything becomes indefensible. Judge Whitfield's forensic accounting contact agreed to audit HOA books with the enthusiasm of someone who specialized in finding money hidden by people who thought they were cleverer than mathematics. His FBI connection would investigate insurance fraud with federal resources and subpoena power that could pierce corporate veils like tissue paper. We'd request asset freezes to prevent further theft while preparing resident class action suits for those illegal assessments that had funded Cordelia's personal legal war. Father Benedict's investigative journalist contacts practically salivated over the story. Bureaucratic corruption, veteran family targeted, community funds stolen, wedding day destruction. The media package wrote itself. Small-town David versus Goliath, except Goliath was embezzling money, and David had federal law enforcement backing his slingshot. Meanwhile, our neighborhood intelligence network operated with efficiency that would have impressed CIA handlers. Dalton's daily dog walks conveniently passed Cordelia's house, documenting suspicious contractor visits and luxury purchases that seemed remarkably inconsistent with her claims of HOA financial difficulties. The man could identify irregular spending patterns from 3 blocks away, which was either impressive investigative instinct or the natural result of decades spent managing school budgets. Savannah tracked every assessment notice and expenditure with spreadsheet precision that revealed patterns invisible to casual observation. Preston photographed evidence being removed from HOA offices during routine maintenance that looked suspiciously like systematic document destruction performed by people who'd never heard of obstruction of justice charges. We organized like a neighborhood watch program crossed with a federal task force, sharing intelligence through encrypted group texts and weekly coffee meetings that appeared completely innocent to outside observers. The beauty of small-town operations: nobody suspects the church ladies and retired teachers of conducting sophisticated financial investigations. Father Benedict's community healing meetings provided legal education disguised as pastoral care, teaching residents about property rights and HOA limitations they'd never realized they possessed. Judge Whitfield explained how financial mismanagement laws applied to volunteer board members who'd assumed their authority was unlimited. I led volunteer flood cleanup efforts, building goodwill while documenting ongoing damage from Cordelia's destruction with photographic evidence that would survive federal court scrutiny. The community response exceeded our most optimistic projections. People who'd been afraid to question authority discovered courage in numbers, and residents who'd felt isolated realized they weren't alone in their suspicions about HOA financial management. Nothing builds solidarity quite like discovering you've all been systematically conned by the same person. Cordelia's reaction to our methodical approach was predictably paranoid and spectacularly counterproductive. Security cameras sprouted around her property like technological mushrooms after rain. She stopped attending public meetings, sending proxies with talking points that sounded increasingly desperate and legally problematic. Bank records showed asset transfers to offshore accounts accelerating, exactly what federal investigators needed to document active money laundering in real time. My property became the secure document storage facility, organized with military precision that would have made supply sergeants proud. Digital copies lived at Marlowe's law firm under attorney-client privilege. Physical evidence went into Judge Whitfield's personal safe with chain of custody documentation that could satisfy Supreme Court evidence requirements. Every document was photographed, every transaction traced, every communication recorded with legal precision that transformed amateur-hour neighborhood corruption into federal felony charges backed by evidence that could survive appellate review. The sound of my printer humming late into the night became the soundtrack of justice being methodically assembled, one damning document at a time. From military logistics experience, I knew the critical details that would seal this case. HOA board members faced personal liability for financial mismanagement, information that would motivate cooperation when federal investigators started asking pointed questions. Property destruction required both criminal prosecution and civil recovery to ensure complete accountability. Insurance fraud carried 10-year federal sentences that made plea bargaining very attractive for anyone smart enough to realize their position was hopeless. Our preparation was reaching critical mass, with federal authorities coordinating arrest timing while we maintained community education and evidence preservation. Cordelia had no idea that every day she delayed surrender was another day of evidence accumulation that would make her eventual sentence exponentially worse. The creek kept flowing over the rubble of my grandfather's dam, carrying the promise that justice flows toward those who forget that water always finds the lowest point. And in this case, that was going to be a federal courthouse with very uncomfortable seating. Cordelia's discovery that her missing financial documents had blown straight into enemy hands triggered a meltdown that transformed months of calculated harassment into weeks of increasingly desperate criminal activity. Her first move proved that panic destroys judgment faster than water erodes limestone. She broke into my property at 2 a.m, searching for documents that were already safely locked away. My trail cameras captured every moment of her amateur burglary attempt, including the 5 minutes she spent cursing at my garden hose after tripping over it like some kind of vengeful yoga instructor. The footage was simultaneously hilarious and disturbing. Cordelia, in designer athleisure gear, wielding a flashlight while attempting stealth operations that would have embarrassed drunk teenagers. But watching someone desperate enough to commit felonies on camera tends to kill the comedy pretty quickly. Her sabotage campaign escalated with all the subtlety of a marching band practicing in a library. Social media posts appeared questioning my mental stability and spreading rumors about dangerous veteran behavior that read like they'd been written by someone whose entire knowledge of military service came from action movies and political attack ads. The harassment crossed every line civilized society pretends exists. Anonymous complaints to the VA questioning my disability benefits. False reports to child services claiming unsafe environment for grandchildren who visited maybe twice a month. She even attempted to challenge Autumn's marriage license, claiming fraudulent venue because the ceremony had been relocated due to her own destructive actions. But Cordelia's desperation produced one gift that perfectly illustrated how panic makes smart people do impossibly stupid things. She hired a private investigator to find dirt on our coalition members, someone named Roland Grimm, who asked very professional questions about our conspiracy against community leadership. What Cordelia didn't realize was that Roland Grimm was FBI agent Roland Grimm, already investigating HOA financial crimes when she'd essentially paid federal law enforcement to strengthen their case against her. Sometimes irony is so perfect it feels like divine intervention with a sense of humor. My counterpunch involved the kind of methodical documentation that drives desperate criminals toward increasingly reckless behavior. Every harassment attempt was recorded, photographed, and filed with appropriate authorities. Trail cam footage of her breaking and entering went to local police and federal investigators. Her social media rants were preserved like evidence in a museum dedicated to self-incrimination. The community response was swift and decisive. Residents who'd been neutral about our troublemaking suddenly realized that someone willing to break into neighbors' homes and file false reports against veterans might not represent ideal community leadership. Several HOA board members resigned rather than risk legal exposure for enabling escalating criminal behavior. Local news coverage was less flattering than Cordelia had probably anticipated when she'd first courted media attention. HOA president's public breakdown made for compelling television, complete with security footage and social media screenshots that painted an unflattering portrait of suburban authority gone completely off the rails. The bribery attempt happened at Murphy's coffee shop on Main Street, where Cordelia arrived with the desperate confidence of someone who'd confused criminal conspiracy with business negotiation. "Mr. Ironwood," she said, sliding an envelope across the scarred wooden table like we were conducting some kind of spy movie transaction, "I believe we can resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding. $500,000 for those documents, and we can all move forward from this regrettable situation." The smell of fresh coffee, mixed with her expensive perfume and the unmistakable scent of pure desperation as she offered to purchase evidence of her own crimes with money that almost certainly belonged to the neighbors she'd been systematically robbing. What made the moment particularly satisfying was the recording device Agent Grimm had suggested I carry, because apparently desperate criminals often provide better evidence than trained investigators can gather through months of surveillance. The quality of her recorded confession would have impressed federal prosecutors who specialized in financial crime cases. Agent Grimm later told me that Cordelia had inadvertently committed 3 additional federal crimes during our 15-minute coffee meeting, including bribery, attempted obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit evidence tampering. Professional criminals spend years learning to avoid such efficient self-incrimination. Cordelia's final desperate gambit involved liquidating remaining HOA funds while planning to flee the country before arrest. She'd booked flights to nations without extradition treaties, transferred assets to accounts already under federal surveillance, and scheduled one last emergency board meeting to transfer authority to her hand-picked successor. Agent Grimm's evening updates became our daily entertainment. Cordelia was essentially following a criminal activity checklist designed by law enforcement to make federal prosecutions easier, while apparently believing she was executing some kind of brilliant escape strategy that would confuse investigators who'd been tracking financial crimes since before she'd discovered offshore banking. The sound of my phone buzzing with intelligence updates had become as regular as evening news broadcasts, except significantly more entertaining and featuring much better character development. Each desperate move was another piece of evidence in what was becoming a federal prosecutor's dream case. The texture of growing evidence files under my hands felt like watching compound interest accumulate, while Cordelia's desperation accelerated toward the kind of public confrontation that would make her wedding day destruction look like a minor etiquette violation. Water keeps flowing downhill, carrying debris toward inevitable destinations, and Cordelia was rushing toward consequences she'd spent months trying to avoid but was now approaching with the efficiency of someone who'd mistaken frantic activity for strategic thinking. The creek still ran wild where my grandfather's careful engineering once controlled its flow, but soon it would carry something more valuable than water toward justice. It would carry the truth about what happens when petty authority meets federal accountability. Cordelia's last stand began with a propaganda campaign that combined the subtlety of a car alarm with the accuracy of a blindfolded dart thrower. Professional flyers appeared throughout the neighborhood featuring stock photos of concerned families and headlines screaming, "Protect our community from violent extremists." The messaging was almost artistic in its complete separation from observable reality. According to Cordelia's alternate universe, I was leading a dangerous militia group of radicalized veterans and disgruntled residents who posed an immediate threat to family safety and property values. The flyers read like they'd been written by someone whose primary sources were dystopian novels and late-night cable news panic attacks. She'd organized an emergency community safety meeting, with all the theatrical production value of a small-town political rally crossed with a particularly dramatic episode of daytime television. The venue was our flood-damaged community center, because nothing says credible leadership like holding meetings in buildings damaged by your own destructive decisions. Her hired security consisted of off-duty police officers who looked professional enough until you realized they were unknowingly providing muscle for someone about to star in a federal perp walk. These guys probably thought they were protecting a concerned citizen from angry neighbors, not enabling the final act of a financial crime spree that would have embarrassed organized criminals. The social media blitz featured sophisticated bot networks spreading fear about property seizure by militant groups and veteran mental health crises threatening neighborhood children. Someone was investing serious money in digital manipulation that might have been effective if our community's idea of social media warfare involved anything more advanced than arguing about school fundraiser logistics on Facebook. But Cordelia's final deception was her criminal masterpiece. Every dollar she transferred to her escape fund was flowing directly into an FBI sting operation so convincing she was essentially paying federal law enforcement overtime to document her money laundering in high definition. Agent Grimm had created a shell corporation so professionally fraudulent that Cordelia was voluntarily funding her own prosecution with the enthusiasm of someone donating to charity. The technical beauty was mesmerizing to observe. Each transaction triggered automatic federal documentation. Every communication was preserved for posterity, and her brilliant escape strategy was being live-streamed to prosecutors who were probably using it as educational material for future cases involving spectacularly self-incriminating defendants. Meanwhile, our coalition's preparation proceeded with the quiet efficiency of people who'd learned that the best revenge is competently executed justice. FBI agents positioned themselves throughout the community disguised as concerned residents who'd coincidentally decided to attend a neighborhood meeting while carrying federal arrest warrants, and probably wondering if all small-town criminals were this cooperative. Local media crews had been briefed but agreed to maintain silence until the appropriate moment, because nothing improves television ratings quite like live footage of someone being arrested immediately after publicly denying the crimes they're about to be charged with. Judge Whitfield ensured legal observers would document proper procedure. Father Benedict organized what he diplomatically termed a prayer circle for community healing, but which functionally served as a peaceful witness network designed to prevent any future claims of intimidation or procedural violations. Marlo Chen filed final court documents for immediate asset recovery and full community restitution. The irony was so concentrated, it could have been bottled and sold as a premium product. Cordelia had scheduled her propaganda performance in a building damaged by flooding she'd caused, funded by money she'd stolen, while addressing residents she'd systematically deceived, surrounded by federal agents she'd accidentally hired to investigate her crimes. Her arrival was choreographed with dramatic flair usually reserved for political campaigns or particularly ambitious reality television. She emerged from a rented Bentley, almost certainly financed with embezzled community funds, wearing an outfit that projected authority she'd never legally possessed, and confidence that would have been inspiring if it hadn't been so completely misplaced. The private security detail looked impressively professional until you considered they were essentially escorting their client to her own arrest ceremony. These officers had no idea they were providing protective services for someone whose evening plans included federal custody and a very uncomfortable conversation about constitutional rights. Cordelia's prepared speech focused on protecting community investment from dangerous elements and maintaining property values against extremist threats. She planned to deliver this performance while standing on a stage surrounded by water damage caused by her own vandalism, denouncing people whose money she'd stolen, while federal agents she'd unknowingly funded took notes for her criminal trial. Agent Grimm later revealed that Cordelia had spent the morning finalizing arrangements to flee the country immediately after the meeting, apparently believing she could orchestrate one final public relations victory before retiring to a beach somewhere with weak extradition policies and strong banking privacy laws. Her optimism was either deeply inspiring or profoundly disturbing, depending on your perspective regarding criminal psychology. Community division was visible as residents entered the damaged building. Newer homeowners clutched propaganda materials, genuinely concerned about safety issues they didn't understand. Long-term residents carried photographs of flood damage and copies of suspicious assessment notices, representing years of accumulated frustration finally approaching resolution. Children's drawings of my grandfather's dam still decorated the walls, artwork created during school visits before Cordelia's destruction, showing clear water flowing peacefully through limestone channels that no longer existed. The contrast between innocent memories and present chaos provided visual testimony to what her community improvement efforts had actually accomplished. The smell of mildew from uncontrolled flooding mixed with nervous anticipation as people filled folding chairs arranged for what would become a live demonstration of how federal justice handles small-town financial crimes. Sometimes the universe provides entertainment so perfectly scripted, it feels like divine comedy written by someone with access to surveillance footage and a particularly dark sense of humor. The Willowbrook Community Center had never hosted anything quite like Cordelia's final performance. 200 residents packed into a space that smelled like mildew and broken dreams, while camera crews positioned equipment with the practiced efficiency of people who specialized in documenting spectacular public failures. Cordelia made her entrance with the confidence of someone who'd confused delusion with strategy, flanked by security guards who looked increasingly uncomfortable as they noticed the unusual number of concerned residents wearing suits and speaking into concealed microphones. Her designer outfit projected authority she'd never possessed, funded by money she'd never earned, for a community she'd systematically betrayed. The PowerPoint presentation was a masterpiece of projection and misdirection. Slide after slide depicted dangerous veterans and property value threats while completely ignoring the water stains covering the walls around her, visual evidence of the flooding her own actions had caused. She spoke about financial responsibility, while federal agents she'd unknowingly hired sat in the audience taking notes on crimes she was about to confess to on live television. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cordelia began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd spent years convincing people that theft was community improvement. "We face an unprecedented threat to our neighborhood's safety and investment security. Extremist elements have infiltrated our community, spreading dangerous lies about our financial management while threatening the very foundations of property value protection." The audience reactions split along predictable lines. Newer residents clutched their propaganda flyers, nodding along with rhetoric that painted their neighbors as domestic terrorists. Long-term residents sat quietly, many holding photographs of flood damage and copies of the assessment notices that had funded this elaborate charade. My coalition occupied the front row with the calm confidence of people who'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. Dalton, Savannah, and Preston sat like poker players holding royal flushes, waiting for the right moment to reveal their cards. Judge Whitfield observed from the side, taking notes with the methodical precision of someone documenting evidence for future legal proceedings. Cordelia's fatal mistake came 20 minutes into her presentation, when overconfidence transformed careful lies into brazen admissions. "I personally authorized the removal of that dangerous dam structure," she declared, gesturing dramatically towards slides showing my property, "because community safety takes precedence over sentimental attachments to outdated infrastructure." The admission of destruction of private property was recorded by multiple cameras and witnessed by 200 residents, but Cordelia was just getting started with her self-incrimination tour. "The HOA exercises full authority over all neighborhood properties," she continued, apparently forgetting that half her audience consisted of people whose property predated her organization by decades. "And we will take whatever legal action necessary to protect our community from troublemakers who spread lies about our financial management." That's when I stood up, approaching the microphone with the unhurried pace of someone who'd been waiting months for this exact moment. "Mrs. Blackthorne," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the damaged room, "thank you for confessing to destruction of private property on camera and in front of 200 witnesses. Now let's talk about something really interesting, like the $847,000 in HOA debt you've been hiding from these residents." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop in the next county. "And the $200,000 you've stolen from your neighbors' pockets through fake invoices to shell companies you control," I continued, pulling out the water-damaged documents that had started this entire investigation. "Should we discuss that on camera, or would you prefer to wait for the federal agents to read you your rights?" Cordelia's face went through a color transition that would have impressed chameleons as the implications hit her like a freight train carrying federal arrest warrants. "Those are lies," she screamed, abandoning all pretense of dignity. "Stop spreading malicious falsehoods. Security. Remove these troublemakers." But her security detail had noticed something she'd missed. The unusually large number of residents displaying federal badges and looking very interested in her response to accusations of financial crimes. Agent Grimm stepped forward with the casual confidence of someone who'd been waiting all evening for his cue. "Mrs. Cordelia Blackthorne, you're under arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud." The sound of handcuffs clicking closed echoed through the sudden silence like the final note of a very expensive symphony. Cordelia's demands to stop this conspiracy and protests about veteran extremists were drowned out by the Miranda warning being read in the patient voice of someone who'd performed this procedure many times before. The community's reaction was immediate and deeply satisfying. Spontaneous applause erupted from residents who'd finally watched justice arrive with handcuffs and federal badges. Tears flowed from elderly neighbors who'd watched their savings disappear into Cordelia's personal accounts. Children asked parents why the mean lady was crying, while police officers explained constitutional rights. Local news cameras captured every moment as Cordelia was escorted from the building she'd damaged, past residents she'd stolen from, toward a federal courthouse where financial crimes were treated with the seriousness they deserved. The live stream went viral within minutes, with hashtags trending that would have embarrassed anyone with functioning shame receptors. National media picked up the story by morning. HOA president arrested during community meeting for massive embezzlement scheme, complete with footage of someone being arrested immediately after publicly denying the crimes she was charged with committing. The remaining HOA board dissolved faster than sugar in rain, unwilling to risk association with federal criminal charges. Community members voted unanimously to create a resident-controlled neighborhood association based on transparency, accountability, and the revolutionary concept that stealing from your neighbors was morally and legally problematic. Agent Grimm later told me that Cordelia had managed to commit 3 additional federal crimes during her final speech, including perjury, obstruction of justice, and making false statements to federal officers who'd identified themselves before the meeting began. The creek outside still ran wild where my grandfather's engineering once controlled its flow. But inside that damaged building, justice had finally found its proper course towards someone who'd forgotten that water always seeks the lowest point, and federal courtrooms tend to be very low indeed. Justice moved swiftly once federal prosecutors had Cordelia's recorded confessions, documented money transfers, and enough evidence to fill a small library dedicated to creative financial crimes. She pled guilty to avoid a 15-year sentence that would have made her eligible for Social Security upon release, receiving 5 years in federal prison, complete asset forfeiture, and a restitution order that would follow her, like a particularly persistent creditor, for the rest of her natural life. The $2.1 million recovery exceeded even our most optimistic projections. Apparently, Cordelia had been more thorough in her theft than anyone realized, including offshore accounts that federal investigators traced with the enthusiasm of treasure hunters armed with subpoena power. Every stolen dollar returned to the community, plus punitive damages that transformed our neighborhood association from bankrupt to better funded than most small-town governments. My personal settlement for property destruction and emotional damages came to $500,000, which felt less like compensation and more like cosmic irony with a very expensive price tag. But money couldn't rebuild 80 years of family heritage. That would require something more valuable than cash. The dam restoration became a community project that would have made my grandfather proud, combining his original limestone with modern engineering that included fish ladders, walking trails, and educational signage explaining how proper water management protects neighborhoods from the kind of flooding that had damaged our community center. Volunteer labor from neighbors reduced costs while building relationships that turned former strangers into something resembling an actual community. Autumn and her husband moved into the renovated farmhouse that spring, making me a grandfather to children who would learn to fish in waters their great-great-grandfather had controlled with hand-cut stone and patient engineering. The sound of young voices echoing across water that flowed clean and controlled felt like the best possible ending to a story that had started with destruction and spite. The Willowbrook Neighbors Association replaced the HOA with democratic voting, transparent budgets, and monthly potluck meetings that actually brought people together instead of driving them apart. Property values increased when potential buyers realized they could purchase homes in a community run by residents instead of aspiring dictators with access to legal fees and offshore banking. We established the Ironwood Veterans Foundation for PTSD counseling, using Cordelia's restitution payments to provide services for military families dealing with the kind of bureaucratic harassment that had nearly destroyed mine. The irony of using her stolen money to help veterans she'd tried to demonize felt like justice, with a sense of humor that appreciated long-term planning. The Willowbrook Environmental Education Center opened near the restored dam, where local schools bring children to learn about water management, community cooperation, and why financial transparency matters in democratic institutions. Teacher-led field trips include hands-on lessons about engineering, environmental protection, and how ordinary citizens can fight corruption when they work together with proper documentation and federal assistance. Our annual Freedom from HOA festival celebrates community independence with food trucks, live music, and educational booths about legal rights that most homeowners never realize they possess. Local attorneys provide free consultations about association bylaws, state oversight requirements, and when HOA authority crosses into criminal territory that requires federal attention. The Scholarship Fund helps young veterans pursue education in engineering, law, and public administration, fields where understanding how systems work prevents the kind of abuse that Cordelia had practiced with such spectacular criminal creativity. Recipients learn that the best defense against corruption is citizens who understand their rights and aren't afraid to document violations with legal precision. Father Benedict's community organizing efforts spread beyond our neighborhood, helping other subdivisions identify financial irregularities and challenge illegal assessments. His network of pastoral care meetings provided cover for legal education that transformed confused homeowners into informed citizens capable of asking uncomfortable questions about budget transparency and fiduciary responsibility. Judge Whitfield became our unofficial legal advisor, teaching residents about sunshine laws, financial oversight requirements, and how to request the kind of documentation that makes embezzlement difficult to hide from federal investigators. His monthly workshops attracted audiences from surrounding counties who'd heard about our successful resistance to HOA overreach. Marlo Chen established herself as the region's leading expert on community legal rights, representing neighborhoods across Missouri in cases involving financial mismanagement, illegal assessments, and unauthorized property destruction. Her success rate attracted national attention to legal strategies that had transformed our local victory into a template for fighting suburban corruption. The ripple effects exceeded anything we'd anticipated when this started as a fight to save one family's dam. Missouri legislature passed HOA reform requiring independent financial audits, sunshine law compliance, and criminal background checks for board members. Other states began investigating their own association oversight requirements after seeing how easily financial crimes could hide behind community improvement rhetoric. The FBI created a task force specifically for HOA financial crimes, using our case as a training example for investigators who'd previously treated neighborhood disputes as civil matters rather than potential federal crimes involving wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that carried serious prison sentences. The final scene played out exactly where it should have, at the restored dam where 4 generations of my family had celebrated life's important moments. Autumn's first anniversary renewal ceremony brought together everyone who'd helped transform personal vindication into community healing, with clear water flowing over new limestone that incorporated stones from my grandfather's original engineering. Judge Whitfield performed the renewal ceremony while Father Benedict blessed water that flowed controlled and purposeful toward neighborhoods protected by proper engineering and transparent governance. Children who'd drawn pictures of the destroyed dam now played along banks where environmental education merged with family legacy in ways that felt like the future my grandfather had envisioned when he'd first placed stone upon stone with patient precision. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's building something better than what they tried to destroy. Standing up to bullies doesn't just save your own property when you do it right. It saves entire communities from people who mistake authority for permission to steal from their neighbors. Share your own HOA horror story in the comments. You might help someone else fighting similar battles against financial corruption disguised as community improvement. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people defeating corrupt systems, because justice isn't just for lawyers and politicians. It's for anyone willing to document evidence and demand accountability from people who've confused elected positions with criminal opportunities. Next week, the city council that tried to seize a family farm for a shopping mall development, and how one stubborn farmer used a 200-year-old property law to turn eminent domain proceedings into a federal investigation of municipal corruption that reached all the way to the state capitol. The creek flows clear over restored stone, carrying promises that water always finds its proper course when good people refuse to let corruption dam the flow of justice toward where it belongs.